Kale Varen had attended hundreds of diplomatic events, but nothing quite like this. The air smelled faintly of copper and orchids, the floor shimmered with reflective scales like a living creature was slumbering beneath the palace tiles, and every breath felt as though it passed through ancient filters of incense and protocol. This was not Earth. This was Cytherian, a jewel world at the edge of the allied galactic territories, known for its silk-spun traditions, its technocratic monarchy, and most importantly, its reluctance to let outsiders meddle in anything remotely sacred. So why Kale, a minor human envoy with a barely used ambassador's badge and a bad shoulder from a shuttle crash, had received a formal invitation to witness the rite of union, the most private and ceremonial of Cytherian rituals, was a mystery even he couldn't spin optimistically. The royal guards had greeted him with curt nods, their eyes unreadable behind iridescent masks. A translator node buzzed gently against his neck, trying to keep up with the flowing musical dialects of the hall. He'd been guided into a waiting chamber made of glass and gold, told only to watch, listen, and not touch anything that glows. Simple. He could handle that. And then the doors opened. He stepped into a hall bathed in amber light, its dome etched with thousands of shifting constellations. In the center, on a dais of living quartz, stood the bride. Elira Vey, crown princess of Cytherian. Dressed in violet regalia and circled by floating crystal orbs, she looked more like a prophecy than a person. Kale's breath caught. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, impossibly so, but because she looked alone. Even in a room filled with nobility and song, she seemed like the only one truly real. The ceremony began. Voices rose. The air thrummed with ceremonial energy. Kale took his place along the edge, careful, silent, an observer. Until the moment the orbs stirred. One by one, they hovered toward the participants. Gliding over the chosen suitor, Prince Vexen of the Eastern bloodline, they circled, paused, and withdrew. A quiet ripple moved through the hall. A hesitation. The orbs did not bind. The high speaker coughed once, nearly swallowed by their robe. Perhaps, another reading. The orbs hovered again. This time, they turned away from Vexen entirely. They pulsed. And then, moved. They drifted to the side of the hall. Toward the outer ring. Toward a very startled, very non-Cytherian diplomat. Kale took a step back. No, he whispered. No, 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 no. The orbs surrounded him. A beam of light shot up, encasing him in a soft glow. The hall fell silent. He heard a voice, deep and resonant, speak in ancient Cytherian. The bond has chosen. A wave of music swept outward. The ceremony seal burned itself into the floor. Kale turned to the high speaker, stunned. What just happened? The elder looked at him, eyes wide, then glanced at Elira. She is yours now. Kale blinked. I think I need to sit down. Elira stepped forward, her voice like a whisper through silk. You are not of this world. I was just here to watch. And now you're the groom. Great, Kale said. Just what I needed. An interstellar wedding I didn't RSVP to. The hall erupted into barely muted chaos. Vexen stormed out, his cape flaring behind him like an offended comet. Elira's attendants whispered urgently. The orbs hovered in a satisfied, rhythmic spiral. Kale stood in the center of it all, bathed in light, tangled in fate, and very much out of his depth. And Elira? She didn't look angry. She looked curious. Almost amused. That was, somehow, worse. Because it meant this might not be a mistake. The room they brought him to afterward was far too comfortable to be a prison, and yet Kale couldn't help feeling like an extremely well-dressed hostage. The ceiling glowed with a calming bioluminescence, the furniture was made of woven metal strands that adjusted to his posture, and there was a carafe of something floral and mildly fizzy on the table that he'd been warned, very politely, not to drink too quickly. He sat in silence, trying to retrace his steps, as if any logical path would lead from minor envoy to accidental alien husband in less than an hour. Across from him sat Alira Vey, her violet ceremonial robe now replaced with something looser and more fluid, though no less regal. She regarded him with calm intensity, her expression unreadable. "The orbs," Kale said finally, "are broken. Clearly. You should have them scanned." "They are ancient," she replied, pouring herself a glass of the fizzy floral liquid. "Sacred. And they do not malfunction." "Then they glitched." "They do not glitch." "Then I'm dreaming. Would you like me to pinch you?" He paused. "That's an oddly human offer." "I've studied your species." "Great. Then maybe you can explain how exactly I just got married." Her gaze didn't waver. "The right of union is a binding covenant. When the orbs choose, the bond is sealed, mind, blood, and legacy. I didn't agree to this. Consent was implied. By standing in the room. By arriving. You were summoned. I thought it was a diplomatic invitation. I brought a gift basket." She tilted her head. "What was in it?" "Cheese. Crackers. A small figurine of a Terran lion." "That's nice." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Alira leaned back. "You are not like the others." "That's probably the first true thing said all day. You do not crave power. You did not rush to claim me. I'd rather rush to an exit, if one's available." But something in her softened. A micro-expression. Almost a smile. "Yet you remained," she said. Kale opened his mouth to argue. But didn't. Because, she was right. He'd stayed. Even after the orbs flared. Even after every eye in the galaxy's most sophisticated empire stared at him like a cockroach on a tiara. He'd stayed. "Look," he said, rubbing his temples. "There has to be a way to undo this." "There is. Thank the stars. But it involves formal petition, 2 witnesses from the high bloodlines, a spiritual severing conducted under eclipse, and potentially, death." He blinked. "Whose death?" "Traditionally, the male." Kale exhaled. "Of course it does." The next morning, Kale was woken by music. Not recorded. Live. A trio of musicians sat outside his quarters, playing a slow, haunting melody on instruments that shimmered like wind chimes dipped in oil. When he emerged, they stood, bowed, and announced, "The groom shall begin his training." Kale stared. "My what now?" An elderly man appeared beside them, holding a crystalline tablet and wearing a robe that looked older than most cities. "I am Tavash. I shall be your bond tutor." "Sounds exhausting already." "Indeed. Let us begin." The training was not combat, not etiquette, not politics. It was, stranger. He was taught how to breathe in rhythm with the palace. How to walk in silence beside another person's thoughts. How to speak using only gaze and tilt of chin. The union, Tavash explained, is not about control. It is about resonance. So, like, emotional Wi-Fi. Tavash blinked slowly. Yes. Let us go with that. He was given robes, fitted armor, a ceremonial dagger, and, oddly, a small glowing crystal that pulsed whenever Alira entered the room. "It's tracking her." "Attuning," Tavash corrected. "It will allow you to sense her needs. Her emotions. Her presence." Kale frowned. "So she can sense me too?" "Oh yes. She will know when you are hungry. Or when you lie." "Wonderful," he muttered. "Just what every relationship needs, surveillance crystals." And yet. As the days passed, the palace became less alien. The air less strange. And Alira? Alira became familiar. Not warm. Not soft. But real. And Kale found himself wondering, just once or twice, what it would feel like to stop running. By the end of the first week, Kale could walk through the royal garden without a guide, identify 7 varieties of scent bloom by smell alone, and perform the 3 sacred head tilts expected of a consort without needing a tutor to whisper reminders in his ear. He'd also accidentally offended a high priest by yawning during a midday bonding recital, nearly stepped into a fountain that wasn't a fountain but a sentient pool of memories, and, worst of all, laughed, out loud, when Alira's second cousin introduced himself as Lord Shimmerthane, Keeper of the Veils and Chief of the Lunar Sheep. That had not gone over well. Still, he was adapting. Somehow. The palace corridors didn't echo quite so menacingly anymore. The silken garb didn't itch like it used to. The food, well, it still tasted like fermented perfume, but he'd learned how to ask for toast without causing offense. What remained a mystery, though, was Alira herself. She was elusive, elegant, a riddle carved from crystal and strategy. He saw her in meetings, rituals, brief passing meals. She always nodded when they crossed paths. She never lingered. Never invited him into her inner circle. Not until the night of the blood moon. He found her on the upper balcony, staring out at the twin moons of Cytherean as one passed fully into eclipse. She didn't turn when he approached. "The stars are older than our houses," she said quietly. "But we keep asking them to bless our unions as though they owe us something." Kale leaned against the railing beside her. "Stars don't care who gets married. They're too busy exploding." A small laugh escaped her. "And yet, that may be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." He smiled. "You need better suitors. I had one. Vexen. Strong. Strategic. Predictable. Then I show up. Uninvited. Unimpressive." She looked at him then, really looked. "You weren't expected," she said. "But you were chosen." "I didn't choose this." "Nor did I." They stood in silence for a moment, the pale red moon casting strange shadows over their faces. Then she turned to him. "I want to understand you," she said. "If we are to be bound." "You want to understand humans?" "No. You." He hesitated. "There's not much to tell. I'm not a hero. I've got debts on 3 planets. I hate formality. And I have no idea what I'm doing here." She stepped closer. "You made no move to claim power. You didn't try to escape. You stay. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe," she said softly. "But maybe you're something more." He blinked. "That sounds dangerously close to a compliment. Do not let it go to your head." She walked away, her robe trailing like a storm behind her. Kale stood there a long time, staring up at the eclipsed moon. And for the first time, he didn't wish he was somewhere else. The following day, the announcement came. The bond was to be sealed officially in front of the full court. No more uncertainty. No loopholes. No ambiguity. It was Kale's last chance to flee. Tavash found him in the corridor. "You have doubts," the old tutor said gently. "Is it that obvious? You walk like a man holding 2 suitcases and no map." Kale chuckled. "That's exactly how I feel. You were chosen by something older than law. Older than blood. You can run. Or you can try to meet it halfway." Kale looked down at the pulse crystal on his wrist. It glowed, faint and steady. "Has anyone ever said no?" Tavash nodded slowly. "One man. 120 years ago. And what happened to him? No one remembers." Kale grimaced. "That's not encouraging." Tavash placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you stay, you will be remembered. Not for bloodlines. Not for titles. But for choice. The hull of ceiling was brighter this time. Not warm. But filled with light. Alira stood on the dais, her expression unreadable. Her hands clasped. Her posture perfect. Kale walked toward her, each step echoing louder than it should have. He stood before her. She raised her hand. He raised his. Their fingers touched. The orbs descended. And this time, there was no resistance. Only resonance. A low hum filled the air. Kale felt something stir, not just in the room, but in himself. A pulse. A tether. Like gravity shifting. And Alira whispered, "Now, we are truly bound." He swallowed. And whispered back, "Then I guess we better figure out what that means." The first week of being officially married to Princess Alira Vey involved very little kissing and a truly alarming amount of scheduling. There were morning rituals that began before sunrise, meditative silences that lasted exactly 47 heartbeats, followed by a shared ingestion of something bitter and ceremonial that Kale referred to, privately, as liquid discipline. There were political briefings, bloodline acknowledgements, robe fittings, and long, spiraling dinners where no one spoke above a whisper and eye contact could mean anything from "pass the salt" to "prepare for civil war." Kale spent most of it smiling politely, trying not to trip over his robes, and mentally reviewing every galactic law that might offer him a loophole back to Earth. But Alira was changing. It wasn't obvious at first. She still walked like a queen carved from obsidian. Still spoke with perfect modulation. Still wore emotion like an accessory she could take off when inconvenient. Yet in small moments, cracks appeared. She would glance his way when she thought no one noticed. Her voice softened when they were alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, she laughed. Not a courtly titter, but an actual, unexpected sound, like music discovering it had breath. Kale found himself listening for it. And, to his horror, looking forward to it. One afternoon, as they walked the mist gardens, a place where air bent strangely and every leaf glowed from within, she asked him a question that surprised them both. "What did you want, before this?" Kale blinked. "Before this? Before the bond. Before the palace. What was your dream?" He thought for a long moment. No one in the palace had asked him that. Not once. "Honestly," he said. "I wanted to own a little ship. Just me and the stars. No debts. No wars. No politics." She smiled faintly. "And now you're married to the heiress of an empire." "Yeah," he said. "Somehow, I got further from that dream and closer to something better. Still trying to decide if that's a tragedy or a miracle." She stopped walking. He turned. And found her watching him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. "I think it might be both," she said. Later that night, she joined him on the balcony without ceremony. No guards. No attendants. Just a bottle of moonfruit wine and 2 glasses. They drank in silence, the stars shifting slowly above them like lazy spectators. "You're adapting," she said finally. "I still don't understand half of what the court says." "That's an improvement. Most understand none of it." He grinned. "They don't like me. They don't know you. They don't want to." She turned toward him. "That's not your fault. I'm not sure it matters." "It does to me." The words hung between them, light and heavy at once. Kale looked at her. Really looked. She was tired. Not physically, but in the way people get when they've carried too much for too long. He reached over. Placed his hand gently over hers. No ceremony. No speeches. Just contact. And she didn't pull away. The next day, Alira made a decision that shocked everyone. She summoned the council and announced that she and her consort would leave the capital. Travel, she said. To the outer provinces. To learn. To listen. To serve. Whispers broke out across the chamber. This was not how things were done. A princess did not wander. A bonded pair did not risk themselves in unstable territories. But Elira held her head high and declared, I would rather be useful than revered. And Kale? He stood beside her. Said nothing. But in that moment, every noble eye turned to him with new weight. And maybe, just maybe, a flicker of respect. Their journey began the following week. 2 guards. 1 diplomatic shuttle. No royal banners. Elira wore simpler robes. Kale wore a jacket he liked. They didn't bring gifts. They brought questions. And in the fractured border worlds of Cytherean's empire, places where old laws broke against newer scars, those questions mattered. Kale listened to miners argue about food rations. Elira sat in silence with a grieving widow who'd lost a child to a military draft her name had authorized. They mediated water rights. Settled border disputes. Laughed, together, when a baby goat refused to stop chewing Kale's boots. And one night, in a quiet tent beneath an unfamiliar sky, Kale reached for her. Not out of duty. Not out of obligation. But because he wanted to. And when she kissed him, she didn't feel like royalty. She felt like home. The road back to the palace never truly existed. Once Kale and Elira left the core, they became different people. Not in the way a mask changes you, but in the way distance allows the self to unfold, slowly, like a flower daring sunlight. They moved from colony to colony, not as royalty, but as something rarer, listeners. Kale adapted faster than anyone expected. He was clumsy, yes, he once bowed to a trade lord's pet instead of the lord himself, and on one memorable occasion, mistook an ancient ceremonial well for a latrine, but he was earnest. And more importantly, unafraid to admit he didn't understand. That mattered in places where the empire had forgotten to look. Places where orders from the palace echoed down corridors and came out warped, unintended, uncaring. But Elira bloomed. She spoke less like a monarch and more like someone rediscovering how to feel. The robe grew simpler. The distance between them shortened. Sometimes she held Kale's hand in public. Sometimes she didn't let go. And somewhere between moon cities and rusting asteroid markets, people started to say it. Not your majesty. Not princess. But Elira and Kale. Together. One name. Then the other. The trouble came on the 3rd moon of Velen Reach. They arrived under the promise of talks, a rebellion brewing, not full-scale war, just unrest. Factions. Distrust. Tensions thick as engine grease. Kale stepped into the first meeting ready to negotiate. What he found was a council armed with silent glares, words wrapped in old wounds, and a new symbol pinned to every jacket. A black sun. Elira froze. Kale didn't know the sign, not yet. But she did. It's Vexen, she whispered. He's behind this. The council leader leaned forward. You're betrothed. You're real one. Former, she snapped. You defied custom, the leader said. The bond was supposed to empower the empire. You bonded with a stranger. A foreigner. Kale said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say. But because this was not his moment. Elira stood tall. I did not defy the bond, she said. The bond chose. And now it must unchoose, the leader replied. That night, they argued in the tent. Elira paced. Kale sat. You knew he might retaliate, he said softly. Not like this. He's using your name. He's using my silence. She turned to him, eyes bright. I thought leaving the capital would let me change things. But all it's done is give him room to poison everything I built. You haven't failed, Kale said. She didn't answer. Just sat beside him. Maybe I should release you, she whispered. He turned. What? The bond. You didn't ask for it. I didn't ask for gravity either, he said, but here we are. She laughed, bitter and quiet. He took her hand. I'm not leaving, he said. You're not getting rid of me that easily. She leaned into him then, forehead against his shoulder. And didn't speak again for a long time. 2 days later, the attack came. Not from rebels. From orbit. Vexen's warship appeared above Velen Reach without warning. No demands. No announcement. Just presence. That was threat enough. The black sun burned on its hull. The same crest that had once been destined to sit beside Alira's. Kale watched the ship hover from the safety of the diplomatic dome, then turned to her. He's here for you. I know. And what happens if you refuse him again? She met his gaze. War. The message came at midnight. A single line, in old Cytherian code, broadcast on open comms. Trial of combat. For the bond. For the throne. Kale read it twice. Then turned to Alira. I don't suppose this is metaphorical. No, she said. It's tradition. Wonderful, he said. So I'm expected to fight an ex-fiancé with a personal death fleet. She said nothing. Then, quietly, you don't have to accept. He looked at her. And smiled. A little sadly. Yes, I do. Because Kale Varen had never won a battle in his life. But for Alira? He'd lose one, beautifully. They held the trial on neutral ground, a gravity-locked plateau beneath the open stars, just far enough from the Velen colonies that no one could pretend they didn't hear the outcome. No cameras. No audience. Just custom. And tradition, apparently, demanded sharp edges. Kale stood at the edge of the ring, wearing ceremonial armor that felt like it belonged to someone braver. The chest plate was too tight. The gauntlets pinched. The sword, yes, an actual sword, was heavier than he expected and far too poetic for his taste. Across from him stood Vexen. Larger. Colder. Trained since birth in 10 forms of martial combat and bred with just enough genetic enhancement to be legally terrifying. He smiled as he approached, eyes glinting like polished steel. So, Vexen said, drawing his blade with flair, this is the human. Kale gave him a mock bow. This is the X. Aren't you out of your depth? Oh, absolutely. The wind shifted. Alira watched from the ridge. Draped in silver. Silent. Pale. Kale caught her gaze just once. She nodded. That was all he needed. The bell rang. And Vexen attacked. Kale blocked the first strike by accident. The second, by instinct. The third sent him sprawling. He rolled, gasping, sand in his mouth, lungs aching. The blade clattered beside him, humming from the impact. Vexen advanced, blade raised. You're not even trying. I'm not, a soldier, Kale wheezed. Then why stand here? Kale pushed himself to his feet. Wobbled. Smiled. Because. I love her. Vexen snorted. Love is weakness. No, Kale said, straightening, it's why I haven't run. He gripped the blade. And this time, he moved first. The fight was not elegant. Kale stumbled. Slipped. Bled. But he didn't stop. He fought like a man with nothing to prove and everything to lose. And somehow, that was enough. He disarmed Vexen with a clumsy feint that was more panic than strategy. Knocked the blade from his hand. And stood over him, gasping. End it, Vexen growled. Kale lowered his sword. No. Coward. No, Kale said again, I'm not you. Then dropped the blade entirely. The silence that followed was louder than the clash of steel. Alira stepped forward. Her voice calm, but sharp. The trial is complete. And in front of all watching, guards, diplomats, warriors of both factions, she walked to Kale. Took his hand. Raised it. And said, he is my bond. By choice. By right. By love. Vexen was exiled within the day. No chains. Just shame. He didn't look back as he boarded his warship. Didn't need to. Because power taken by force never lasts. And everyone watching had seen what true strength looked like. Not a blade. Not a title. A man who stayed. Back at the palace, everything was different. Kale didn't sit in the back rows anymore. Didn't wear borrowed robes. He was addressed formally now, Prince Consort Kale of the Inner Circle. Still sounded wrong in his ears. Still made him laugh when no one was listening. But when Alira spoke beside him, fingers brushing his underneath the table, it didn't feel so ridiculous anymore. The bond was no longer a curse. It was a compass. One evening, in the Temple of Echoes, Alira lit a candle and said nothing. Kale stood beside her. Watched the flame sway. Then said, softly, what happens now? She looked at him, eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. We rule. Together. She smiled. How else? That night, the stars over Cytherian pulsed brighter than usual. At least, that's what the palace astronomers claimed. Kale thought maybe the sky was just finally paying attention. The throne room was never designed to feel human. It stretched too high, echoed too long, shimmered with ancient stone and bioreactive light that shifted subtly with the mood of the empire. Even when empty, the space made you feel like a whisper inside a cathedral of judgment. And Kale, still not quite used to the weight of ceremonial robes or the sensation of being saluted, stood at the edge of it now, watching the court assemble for what had once been unthinkable. Today, Alira Vey was not just reaffirming her rule. Today, she was naming her co-ruler. Him. Prince Consort was the legal title, yes. The traditional role. But what Alira planned to do next broke every precedent written in crystal or carved into the roots of Cytherian law. She was about to give him equal voice. Equal power. Kale was still struggling to finish his toast that morning. He stood beside her on the dais, surrounded by the murmurs of skeptical nobles, wandering eyes, and orbs that pulsed with ancient memory. When Alira raised her hand, silence swept the hall like gravity itself obeyed her. My bond mate, she said, voice clear and low, has proven not only his worth, but his heart. Some nobles flinched at that word. Heart. Too soft. Too wild. Too human. But she didn't pause. He chose this path when he had none. He stood for peace when war was easier. And in the old trial, he showed restraint when he had every reason for rage. The orbs drifted toward Kale now, hovering like curious spirits. They spun slowly, silver light dancing around him, seeking truth. And the moment stretched. Until they pulsed once, bright. Approval. Alira nodded. Let this bond not be a compromise of tradition, but an evolution of it. She turned to Kale. Offered her hand. And he took it. Before the court. Before the stars. Before the echoes of 1,000 years of monarchy. The days that followed were slow and strange. Kale sat in council. He listened. He learned. He vetoed a mining bill that would have displaced half a moon's population. Suggested educational grants instead of ceremonial murals. Laughed during a summit when someone called him an adorable political accident, and won the room not by shouting, but by smiling and asking the one question no one expected: what if we try it differently? He didn't try to become a Cytherian. He didn't wear their masks or speak in veils. He remained himself. Which, oddly enough, became exactly what they needed. And Alira? She grew lighter. Not softer, never soft, but free. She still walked like she owned gravity, but now she shared the weight. Let Kale take part of it. Let herself breathe when she forgot how. Their evenings became quieter. Their bed no longer divided by uncertainty. They learned each other the way ancient maps learn stars, not quickly, but precisely. Gently. With reverence. 1 year later, they stood in the Sky Gardens, now open to the public for the first time in 4 centuries, and watched children run through vines of glowing ivy. "Do you miss Earth?" Alira asked. Kale shrugged. "Only sometimes. Mostly the coffee. We have coffee. You have, an herbal simulation of the idea of coffee." She smiled. "Would you go back, if you could?" He looked at her. At the crown that now fit her head like a halo, not a cage. At the hands that still trembled, now and then, but only when she thought no one noticed. At the people who smiled at her as they passed, not because they feared her, but because they believed in her. And he said, "I did go back. I just didn't know it until I got here." She kissed him. Not as a queen. Not as a princess. Just as Alira. His bond mate. His impossible miracle. His home. In time, the story would change. They'd be called many things. The sovereigns of the divide. The Starbond pair. The Peace Weavers. But to each other, in quiet hours, when the orbs were dim and the stars steady. Just Alira and Kale. Just 2 people who never should have worked. But somehow always would. So that was the story. Not of conquest. Not of empires carved through flame and fear. But of a diplomat who didn't run. And a princess who risked being human in a palace built on perfection. It wasn't easy. It never is. Love, especially the kind born by accident and tested by fire, doesn't arrive in neat packages. It unfolds through trial. Through the awkward, clumsy courage of staying. Of listening. Of changing, together. Kale could have said no. Alira could have let tradition win. But they didn't. And that choice, that simple defiance of what should have been, rippled outward. Across a palace. An empire. And finally, the stars themselves. Because real change doesn't begin with declarations. It begins when 2 people decide to walk forward, side by side, even when the path isn't clear.